Hello, and welcome back to Reading Between the Lines. It is the eve of the new League One season, so I thought I would jump on the old tactics board to talk through something I've noticed in pre-season that I think we've got a good chance of seeing in the opener against Birmingham. Um, and if not, I'm sure we'll see at some point throughout the season, given it's been a pretty consistent theme through the preseason games. So what I'm going to talk about is how we're setting up off the ball to try and press the opposition, because it's changed a little bit from what we saw last season. With that in mind, before I talk too much about what I think we're going to see, let's go back and look at what we saw last season. So, as I'm sure everybody remembers, we started last season with the now, much criticised 4-2-2-2, and a big part of that philosophy is about placing men up the pitch in positions to pick up the ball, right, to press. And typically, how we would be set up in that 4-2-2 would be either in this sort of 4-2-4 sort of setup, but often we would push another man forward, and this would end up, something like a 4-1-3-2. Now, one of the big criticisms of this period was that we were a bit too easy to play against. Didn't have enough men around the ball, and the team then moved away from that, and Sellers and the coaching staff moved to a different setup, and we had a much better sort of second half of the season. One of the issues, and this was confirmed pretty much by James Oliver Pearce, the one of the coaches at Reading, on the excellent Tile SM podcast they did last season, was that one of the issues they found was that too many teams in League One either abandoned their plans to pass out from defence short earlier than they thought, or never had one to begin with and would just bypass the press, right? And often what was happening was teams would just bypass this press. You'd have a lone man here getting a bit swamped, basically, and teams were able to pick up those second balls a little bit too easy and sort of get at our back line. So from there we moved and we played a couple of different setups for the last 2/3 of last season. Primarily, it was either a 4-2-3-1 like we see here, or it was more of a 4-3-3. Right. Now, obviously, formations fluid. This is just a bit of a picture of how it can look. But also, this isn't really how we would set up in the press in either of those setups, right? So typically, what we would see is Harvey Knibbs, who was a revelation when brought in field, would often tuck up in front with Sam Smith, and we would still end up pressing in a sort of 4-2-4 setup. The difference being that once that press was beaten, Knibbs had the energy and the engine to sort of get back a bit more, and when we were deeper in our own half, we could really pack in some more numbers into that midfield. But even in the 4-3-3, even in the 4-2-3-1, you'd often see, usually if it was, Savage and wing, or maybe Craig and wing in some of the setups, you'd see that other centre mid sort of end up moving forward, and especially if, the opposition had midfielders coming towards the defence, coming towards the ball to pick it up, you'd see a midfielder track along, and again, you end up in this 4-1-3-2 sort of setup. So, one of the things that's been consistent with this preseason has been a 4-3-3, right? And we've often seen Lewis Wing playing as the deepest, and then we've seen a lot of Ben Elliott, and then we've seen some of Savage, but largely towards the end it looks like it's going to be Harvey Knibbs filling this role, right? So not too different from last season, right? But what has been different is actually the way we're setting up out of possession, especially in sort of the early phases where the opposition has it deep in their own half, we've seen quite a big change, but a familiar shape. So what we're seeing happen a lot is the two wingers are typically narrow and pressing high. The striker is sort of dropping in, and we have the midfield three sort of poised to go and press, right? And we sort of end up in what is quite a familiar 4-1-3-2 sort of setup, right? And we've seen slight variations on this, and I'm sure we will continue throughout the season to do this. It was very, very obvious in the Cardiff friendly, especially in the second half, primarily because, you know, Cardiff were often doing what we do, which is have their own centre backs right on the 6-yard line and play from there. So what you would see is, you know, Aziz or Camara was starting, I suppose. So Camara and Kelvin would be, you know, in these sort of positions. You had Smith or Wareham would be tucked up here. The midfielders would all be along like this. And you end up in, you know, what is often, you know, a little bit more like a diamond, but, you know, effectively is the same idea, right? It's a 4-1-3-2 of sorts. And, you know, our wide players were incredibly narrow in this sort of setup. So that's the sort of basics of it. What I'm going to do now is sort of take a look at how that looks when we add some opposition players. Okay, so we're back now, and we've got some opposition players on the pitch, and we've got them set up in a sort of, you know, 4-2-3-1 here. And what is typically happening is from a goal kick, and I'm going to take an example that we saw from the game against Hull, which is, you know, Hull, unlike Cardiff, we're not setting up their centre backs right on the sort of 6-yard box like we would. There would sort of be a more sort of conservative and maybe more traditional sort of just a split centre back. Fullbacks would be sort of wider then again, and what they actually often were doing was sort of dropping a centre mid in between. And then, you know, obviously they've got their wide players, they've got, you know, another couple of midfielders in there, right? So I've put us in our 4-3-3, but actually, like I said, this is not how we were really setting up in order to press. What actually was happening is Femi was wide and basically man marking, you know, one man here. Kelvin was tucking in as well. We were largely leaving that man not free, but Smith was, you know, as I said, dropped in a bit. We'd have our wide centre mids in there poised, and, you know, basically what the setup has is, you know, wingers marking centre backs, and often the out ball either, you know, directly from a goal kick, or, you know, often what happens is, right, the ball gets played out to one of these players, gets cycled around a little bit, but, you know, we're man marking a lot of players in here. Somebody will be tight to the striker, right? We've got a free centre back, and more often than not, what's happening is the ball is being funneled, right, out to a fullback. And what happens is ball comes out to a fullback, and our centre mids are then flying across the pitch to the press, right? Our fullbacks are touch tight to their wingers. You know, typically at this point, you know, a centre attacking midfielder is coming over. Wingy was following them, and then the centre mid on the other side is sort of tucking over. And what was happening often was we're forcing the ball into areas that we want it to be, right? So forcing it out, you know, what is often quite a difficult ball, either directly from a goalkeeper or from, you know, a centre mid here with lots of men around him, into a fullback. Fullbacks having to take control of that ball, got a centre mid flying at them. They're pinging a ball down the line to a winger who is being pressed touch tight by a fullback. You know, maybe they try a little ball in field, right? And we're in a great position to nick this ball, right? And the other benefit that we're getting out of this that we sort of weren't getting in, the setups we had last year, where you'd have, Nibs and Smith, as that furthest forward players, is look at the positioning here of, our wide players, our most impactful 1v1 players. You've got, Nibs, who's sort of drifted wide, but actually you've got Aziz and Kelvin, who are both good 1v1 players, but particularly Femi, right, is in a lot of space. And what was happening, often was, we'd be able to nick this ball. Either it's breaking down and Nibs, or I suppose on this side, Elliot, is picking up the ball, right? And we're able to drive, and we've got 3 men really high up the pitch, 1v1 often, right? Or, as sort of happened afterwards, was, obviously players are sort of following along here, right, as the ball is progressing. And there was one instance where I think Wing basically nicked the ball, came out with it, and played a ball straight through the line here, and Femi, had a chance, and actually it was the chance he sort of had just inside the box, where he probably could have driven on, another few meters into the box and scored, but took it a little bit early, and it was a bit of a tame shot. But what it does is it's luring players, it's channeling the ball into where we want it to be. It's then making them play, or giving them, the only real option is to play, quite a high risk pass into the center of the pitch. One of the principles with all of Sellers' ball has been balls into the center of the pitch are there for us to go get, right? Be really competitive there. And if we do win it, then we have got dangerous players in really dangerous areas. And in Wing, we've got a player that can find them. In Elliot, we've got a player that can turn out of tight situations if that's where he wins it. Still need to work on, final ball, but can carry it and create from there. And we've got a setup where we can be really, really dangerous when we win the ball. That's not to say we weren't last season, right? We were a great transition team. But I think if you give me Femi, Smith, and Kelvin high up the pitch, or even if it's just Femi and Kelvin high up the pitch, 1v1 versus centre-backs, and we get that situation several times a game with the ball fed into them and just saying, go run at them, and not run at them from the halfway line, but run at them basically outside of their own box, that is a really, really promising position to be in. And that's not to say that, like, Sam Smith isn't still going to probably be our main source of goals, doesn't play a massive role, but he can then crash the box as well, right? It's not like he's, so far away from the play that he isn't able to get involved there. But getting a position where we're not relying on, Kelvin and Femi being forced and tucked back into sort of a deeper 4-4-2, we're able to hold them higher for longer in this sort of setup, partly because Smith is the one tucking in. It's a lot of work for the wide centre mids, right? But it leaves some really dangerous players in some really dangerous positions for longer. Eventually, if the team then play out and they're able to get the ball, then we sort of end up dropping a bit deeper, and Femi will tuck in and Kelvin will tuck in, and we'll be in a more sort of I suppose natural 4-5-1 sort of setup, right? But we actually were holding this sort of narrow wide players setup for quite a few phases, and until the ball was actually quite deep, again because we're trying to force that ball out wide. It leaves quite a lot of 1v1 defending, right, which I'm sure at points will not go our way. But one of the benefits of having Mbenge at the back is he can cover huge amounts of space, super aggressive, does often come out of that with the ball, thankfully. But he can, obviously allow us to play higher. He can cover fullbacks who then track wingers far up the pitch. So he's a bit of a game changer in this setup as well. But yeah, just an interesting quirk, bit of a change from last year. I think it sets us up better in the sort of 4-1-3-2 press that we want to. Sellers seemingly wants to employ. at least in some games. I think this version of it feels better than some of the versions we were playing last season, just in terms of gives us a little bit more cover because you've got 3 centre mids sat in there until they're needed to spring out. And also when we do win it, we're really well set up to go and hurt teams in the counter press. So yeah, we'll see whether that comes up. Just a little video from me, and hope everybody enjoys the start of the season.